As we've discussed in previous lectures, all of us will have to adapt in ways large and small to our changing environment. Where we live, our livelihoods, and our day-to-day comings and goings will all be affected. For some of us, these changes will be small. For others, these changes will be massive. And for some more of us still, the barriers to adaptation will be seemingly insurmountable. By barriers to adaptation, we mean the challenges faced by an individual, organization, or society in changing to more effectively navigate the physical environment. We'll talk about 4 broad categories of barriers to adaptation. 1. Scientific, 2. Organizational, 3. Political economic, and 4. Social and cultural. These 4 types of barriers interact with the challenges inherent to the phases of adaptation more generally identified by Suzanne Moser and Julia Ekstrom in the article you read for this week. The understanding phase, in which the problem is diagnosed, the planning phase, in which solutions are offered and discussed, and the implementation phase, or how we actually turn thought into action. Before discussing those broad categories of barriers, let's talk about the phases of adaptation. As the saying goes, the first step to solving a problem is recognizing and admitting that you have a problem in the first place. This is the understanding phase, and it consists of the dark-colored steps in this schema: detecting the problem, gathering information, and finally reconceptualizing the problem in a way that facilitates action. Let's take a very basic example. I wake up at 2 a.m. and smell smoke. I then go into my kitchen to find the stovetop was left on and has started a fire. I then realize that my problem is not a smoke problem, but a fire problem, so I can act accordingly. The next step involves planning, developing options, assessing those options, and choosing a course of action. To keep with the example, my mind begins to race. Do I fight the fire? Do I immediately wake my family and get them out of the house? Do I fight the fire while awaking my family? If the fire is small and still contained, I might just smother it with a towel. If the fire is larger, I might go for the fire extinguisher. If the fire is larger still and now spread to the wall, I'm getting me and my family out of there while I still can. The implementation stage comes when you translate the planning stage into action. In our example, the implementation stage is pretty straightforward. Depending on how severe the fire is, I either smother it, fight it, or run like hell. Finally, the last stage is the stage involving the after action. Did the intervention work? Did we make the right call? Because climate change is a wicked problem, it makes planning and implementation very difficult for 2 reasons. First, the partial solutions we devise to addressing climate change themselves create second-order problems, or problems that follow from solutions to the first problem. For example, in the 1980s, the United States was convinced its main problem, in the security sense, was the Soviet Union, so funding and arming enemies of the Soviet Union in Afghanistan seemed like a good idea. And perhaps, in the short term, it was. The Soviet Union's war effort in Afghanistan, combined with slumping oil prices, essentially bankrupted the Soviet system and ended the Cold War. But it had the second-order effects of empowering anti-Soviet but also anti-US actors like Osama bin Laden, and making bitter enemies of the humiliated Soviet elite, some of which would go on to be the current Russian elite. Second, because the stakeholders in the issue of climate change are so diverse, there will not be universal agreement on the nature of the problem, the policy options, or the best course of action to resolve them. Our climate politics clearly illustrate this. If you're a struggling coal miner working at the West Elk mine near Paonia, Colorado, your understanding of the acceptable solutions to climate change is probably very, very different from mine, because your livelihood depends on fossil fuels. And these different interpretations are not just differences of opinion over facts, they are differences over values, what goals we choose to prioritize as a community over others. Do we prioritize long-term sustainability or short-term survival? Do we prioritize maximizing economic productivity or ensuring equality? In these situations, there is generally no right answer, the way that there is a right answer for how to generate the necessary lift to get an Airbus 380 off the ground. That's because it's a technical problem, not a wicked problem. It's a hard problem to solve, but it is clearly solvable. The scope and scale of adaptation are functions of time, resources, and capacity for fundamental change inherent to a system. Let's return to Figure 1 from the Moser and Ekstrom piece. Adaptive practices can range from the short-term oriented and fairly cheap in terms of time and energy, to the long-term oriented and incredibly costly. If my roof has a leak, I can muddle through in the short term by putting a bucket under the drip. It's cheap, easy, and doesn't require fundamental change or big resource outlays. But if I want to address the problem over the longer term, I'll have to invest time and resources in fixing the roof. And if I want to address the root drivers of the leaky roof, perhaps problems with the building code or a bad contractor, I have to spend more time and resources still. Alright, having painted the adaptation process in broad brushstrokes, let's talk about barriers to adaptation: scientific, organizational, political economic, and social cultural. Scientific barriers to adaptation are the barriers presented by our failure to understand problems or devise technical solutions to them. The miasma theory of disease was the most prevalent understanding of disease for most of the last millennium, and held that diseases, such as cholera, chlamydia, and the Black Death, were caused by a miasma, which is an ancient Greek word for pollution, a poisonous form of bad air, also known as night air. The theory held that epidemics were caused by miasma, emanating from rotting organic matter. Of course, none of those diseases were caused by foul smells. They were caused by microscopic bacteria, which meant that they could be spread from person to person or through human and animal waste. Thus, countless people over centuries died because of an incomplete understanding of how disease spread, which stymied attempts to engineer solutions. Not being able to correctly diagnose a problem meant that the solutions proposed thereto were bound not to work. It wasn't until the 1850s that John Snow, no, not that John Snow, traced a large cholera outbreak in London to contaminated water, that the miasma theory began to fall out of favor and the modern concepts of sanitation and antibacterial disinfection came into being. Even if the problem is correctly diagnosed, there may be scientific barriers to its solution. The problem of interdicting an intercontinental ballistic missile is seemingly straightforward. You track it and shoot it down with another projectile. The problem is that intercontinental ballistic missiles travel incredibly fast and leave the atmosphere for a good chunk of their travel. By the time they reach their target, they're traveling about 4.3 miles per second, or about 7 times faster than a bullet fired from a modern rifle. That's really fast. Conceptually, the solution is simple. Technically, it's virtually impossible to implement.
You know what you are? You are the Charlie Brown of missile defense. The Pentagon is Lucy.
I'm not familiar with the reference, sir.
Peanuts, Charlie Brown.
I've heard of them. I'm just not conversant in them.
Why?
I've never read the comics.
Leo, were you born at the age of 55?
I know that there's a dog.
Charlie Brown wanted to kick a football and Lucy would hold it, except she'd pull it away at the last minute and Charlie Brown would fall on his butt.
That's funny.
No, but each time Lucy would find a way to convince Charlie Brown that this time she wouldn't pull the ball away, but she would, and once again Charlie Brown would fall on his butt.
And that's funny?
It's satirical.
What's it satirizing?
The DOD bringing you to the Situation Room every time they run a new missile test so that you can come tell me how great it works, so I'll put money in the NMD system.
You should put money in the NMD system.
Doesn't work.
It will work one day, soon. There are a couple of 3-star generals in there. Call them Lucy and you're on your own.
Good morning, Mr. President.
Hey.
Where are we?
The kill vehicle's on a clear trajectory.
What's its time to the target?
50 seconds. Colonel, could you walk the President through?
Yes, sir. Mr. President, approximately 3 minutes ago, a missile was launched with a simulated nuclear warhead from the Kwajalein Atoll in the South Pacific.
And it's going to hit my garage in New Hampshire exactly when?
Well, sir, once the missile cleared cloud cover, it was detected by the early warning satellites, which launched an interceptor or kill vehicle.
SRB-SEP is solid rocket booster separation. Now, that means the high-resolution radar on the ground has gotten a lock-on signal from the kill vehicle.
Go SRB-SEP. Confirm solid rocket booster separation. Kill vehicles away, coming over at 044. Roger. Roger, Control. Pick out that 447. 20 seconds. Go at 447. Go flight.
So what happens now?
In 20 seconds, it collides with the nuclear warhead.
Where?
Outer space.
17 miles above the Earth's atmosphere.
Okay, but we don't have anybody out there right now, do we?
Sir.
When we stay at the Oriental in Bangkok, we have to check out James Michener's typewriter.
Intercept in 5.
Here we go.
4, 3, 2, 1.
Is that silence usually a pretty good sign?
No.
Negative intercept.
Have we got sensor readings?
No.
Negative intercept. KM warhead has overshot its target.
It was just enthusiastic.
By how much?
Leo?
By how much did it miss the target?
Colonel?
137
We missed it by 137 feet.
miles.
We missed it by 137 miles?
When you consider the size of outer space, Leo, that's not so bad.
Sir.
The way the words you're looking for are, oh, good grief.
Another class of barriers is organizational. That is, how society divvies up the task of addressing a problem. Climate change and pandemic diseases are two excellent examples. The United States spends upwards of $1 trillion per year on national security, when you combine the budgets of the Department of Defense, the intelligence agencies, the part of the Department of Energy that oversees nuclear weapons, and other assorted costs. Those expenditures are supposedly intended to protect the U.S. from attack and major loss of life. But those expenditures have proven mostly useless in preventing loss of life and damage to the nation caused by wildfires and the COVID pandemic. U.S. national security strategy, and therefore spending, is designed to identify, deter, and/or compel other armed actors. Now, if North Korea or ISIL managed to kill 200,000 Americans or set ablaze half the western United States, you can be damn sure that there would be a response strategy designed to punish those actions and deter future ones. And that strategy would be backed by the most fearsome collection of military capabilities to ever exist: a huge nuclear arsenal, the world's most technologically advanced and capable military, and a vast network of allies to join in the fight. COVID and climate change are effectively doing just that right now, and the inadequacy of a conventional security mindset, to say nothing of a policy response, has been laid pretty bare. The nuclear triad, the Fifth Fleet, and SEAL Team 6 are about as relevant for addressing climate change and the pandemic as a hammer is for fixing a pocket watch. Think about how different a situation we might be in were the CDC and the Department of Interior supported the way the DoD is. A third barrier to adaptation is political economic. That is, barriers to change that exist because politically and/or economically influential actors have deliberately resisted those changes. The science is crystal clear. In order to mitigate further climate change, the economies of the world must decarbonize their energy systems. While some of the main barriers to doing so are still technological, many barriers revolve around the massive sway hydrocarbon-based energy companies have over the global economy. 6 of the 10 highest-earning companies on Earth are oil companies, and those oil companies have invested billions in finding vast oil reserves. And decarbonization will render all of those assets, in the form of those vast reserves, significantly less valuable, if not utterly useless. This is why energy companies have resisted, both through lobbying and through billions spent in public advertising campaigns, attempts to introduce carbon taxes and other measures designed to curb gasoline consumption, like the 2018 proposed revisions to the Corporate Average Fuel Economy, or CAFE standards, introduced by the Trump administration. Finally, a fourth class of barriers to effective adaptation is social and cultural, features of a society that make it more or less likely to adapt in the face of a challenge. Differing responses to halting the spread of COVID illustrate this quite clearly. Some of the most successful countries at responding to COVID have been Taiwan, South Korea, Vietnam, Japan, and China. Though all experienced early outbreaks, all were relatively successful in quickly containing the disease and limiting infection and death. Perhaps not coincidentally, all of these countries' cultures are heavily influenced by Confucianism, a school of thought originating in China in the 5th century BCE. Confucian culture places a high premium on social harmony, respect for authority, and individual duty and responsibility to society. In contrast, United States political culture emphasizes the concept of liberty, or the state of being free within society from oppressive restrictions imposed by authority on one's way of life or behavior. Liberty is a concept that is absent in, and pretty much alien to, Confucianism. The term suyu is about as close as Confucianism gets, and that word wasn't even adopted until the 19th century by East Asian philosophers struggling to translate and come to grips with Western political theory. Now think about these two very different types of value structures, and tell me which of those societies you think would do a better job of wearing a mask to protect themselves, but more importantly, protect others.
突如其来啊，这个疫情考验着世界，那么当然也考验着中国啊。那么中国抗疫的成功，那么显现出这个中国传统文化，那么它的强大力量。所以啊，这个今年的文明论坛，是吧，在孔子故里进行召开，那么我觉得它的意义真的很重大，它让我们重新思考，那么这个中华文明它的价值和意义，思考中国抗疫成功啊，它的文明的深厚根基。
这就是基于我们中国的文化，我们不自私，不是讲究个人安全和自由，我们讲究的是集体安全、集体繁荣。所以，因此我们为什么能率先战胜新冠肺炎，率先复工复产？事实上，也是基于这中华文明很大的磅礴量。
今年は新型コロナウイルスにより日中両国の交流はかなり制限されておりますが、そういう中でも日中の国民は産が異域、風月、同天という言葉のもとに思いを新たにして平和友好の絆を強めたいと思っております。我々は共に儒教古典を語り、対話交流を進化させ、文化をもって世界を照らし、文明をもって未来を語り、共に人類の文明発展のため新しい貢献をしていこうではありませんか。
Now, this is not to say one set of values is superior to the other, or that liberty does not have considerable virtues. It is, however, to say that some social and cultural values are more suitable for dealing with certain problems than with others. This lecture has discussed 4 categories of barriers to adaptation: scientific, organizational, political economic, and social cultural. Adapting to climate change is affected in different ways across societies by all 4 of these barriers. Next time, we'll discuss barriers to mitigation, some of which are similar to barriers to adaptation, and how those attempts to mitigate climate change are having unintended consequences.